I now give the floor to Ms. Virginia Gamba.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I thank Ambassador Woodward for her remarks and for hosting today's open debate. I deeply appreciate the United Kingdom's long-standing support to the Children and Armed Conflict mandate, as well as the collective commitment of Security Council members. Thank you also to my co-briefers and to all of you for your presence here and online today. I value the attention given to this important issue. In 2017, the year in which I took office, the Secretary General's report covered 20 situations across 4 geographical regions and documented 21 Southern grave violations verified the previous year. The mandate has since grown significantly. It now spans across 5 geographical regions and covers 26 situations. 2 new situations, Haiti and Niger, have been added given the worrying and unfolding security situations on the ground. Detailed information on both will be included in next year's report, as was done for Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Ukraine, which were added in 2022 and are featured for the first time in the report before you. The challenges that the world is facing also increased and layered on each other. Just to mention a few, climate insecurity added a layer to the fight over resources and forced displacement. The accumulation of explosive remnants of war and mines added new dimensions to killing and maiming of children. And terror tactics of armed groups were played out against children and their education rights, particularly those of girls. And the situation outlined in this year's report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict before you reflect on all of this. 27,180 grave violations against 18,890 children were verified by the United Nations last year. These include 2,880 violations that were late verified. 8,630 children were either killed or maimed, 7,622 children were recruited and used, and 3,985 children were abducted. These 3 violations remain the ones verified at the highest level, and all of them increased in 2022. Children were killed or injured in airstrikes, by explosive weapons, by live ammunition, in crossfire, or in direct attacks. In many cases, they fell victim to explosive remnants of war. Rape and sexual violence against children, although chronically underreported, was also verified at high levels. 1,165 children, almost all of them girls, were raped, gang raped, forced into marriage or sexual slavery, or sexually assaulted. Some cases were so severe that they resulted in the death of the victims. The crimes committed against these children are horrifying. Overall, the United Nations verified attacks on 1,163 schools and 647 hospitals. This represents a 112% increase compared to the year before. 50% of these attacks were perpetrated by government forces. In addition, the use of schools and hospitals for military purposes remains a major concern. It exposes teachers, students, medical personnel, and patients to harm, and often leads to damage to or the complete destruction of civilian infrastructure. The United Nations verified a sharp increase of over 60% of such cases last year, conducted by both armed forces and armed groups. In situations of conflict, when protection, education, healthcare, food production systems, water facilities, and essential services are weakened or broken down, the only hope left for children and communities often comes in the form of humanitarian assistance. But this too is increasingly under threat. In 2022, the United Nations verified 3,931 incidents of the denial of humanitarian access to children. Humanitarian workers were killed, assaulted and abducted, humanitarian supplies were looted, and assets and vital infrastructure were destroyed. Bureaucratic impediments and restrictions on movements further complicated the delivery of humanitarian aid. Given the increasing control over the work of humanitarian actors and restrictive laws, this, unfortunately, is a deteriorating trend as well. Madam President, Excellencies, we should never forget that behind each verified violation is the life of a child with its own individual story. 8,890 children were affected last year, and yet their stories are not told, as is the case of the 3 girls gang raped in South Sudan during 5 days of terror, the boys killed by an IED in a school in Afghanistan, the 14-year-old girl in Myanmar abducted and burnt alive, the girl with amputated limbs as a result of airstrikes in Ukraine, and so many more. This is why we must remember that behind the figures are the faces of children suffering from armed violence around the globe. We must do more to prevent and protect our children from the ravages of armed conflict. Despite the need to protect our children better, there are simply too many areas we do not have access to, too many situations where the demands far outweigh our monitoring capacities, and too many victims and witnesses have already been silenced. All too often, children and their communities either do not have access to safe reporting channels and assistance, or are too afraid to make use of them. Boys are often taught that being a victim undermines their masculinity. Societies shame girls for the harm done to them. Communities are put under pressure. Human rights defenders and humanitarian workers are threatened, and thus those most in need of our support are left alone in their suffering without receiving care or justice. In some cases, child victims, instead of receiving protection, are punished for their circumstances. Last year, 2,496 children were deprived of liberty for their actual or alleged association with parties to conflict. Being particularly vulnerable at the hands of authorities, children under detention were exposed to further violations of their rights, including torture and sexual violence. In some cases, they were even sentenced to death. Finally, justice and accountability continue to elude children. Despite progress in some situations, grave violations against children continue to go unpunished, and perpetrators are unchecked by the national and international legal systems. We owe it to children to guarantee them access to justice. And while acknowledging that armed groups, including those designated as terrorists by the United Nations, were responsible for 50% of grave violations, I would like to underscore that the main perpetrators of the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access in 2022 were the armed and security forces of governments. And these are governments whose primary responsibility is to ensure the protection of civilians, including children. Madam President, Excellencies, in the face of ongoing tragedies that children endured, our hope remains unwavering. The relentless commitment of my office and the United Nations on the ground, actively engaging with parties to conflict, has not only given us purpose, but has also empowered us to strengthen our efforts. For instance, upon assuming the office in 2017, a total of 8,052 incidents of recruitment and use of children were documented. Nevertheless, by 2022, this number has decreased to 7,622 incidents, despite the fact that we are reporting on 6 more situations than in 2017. These figures attest to and reinforce the ongoing significance of our mandate and its effects when consistently applied. Allow me to also underline the positive achievements accomplished thanks to the United Nations engagement with all parties to conflict, which led to concrete results in multiple situations last year. In Yemen, we signed an action plan with the Houthi, who call themselves Ansar Allah, to end and prevent violations. This is the 3rd commitment signed in Yemen, meaning the United Nations has engaged concretely with all 3 major parties to the conflict. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mai Mau machine, signed unilateral commitments to protect children. In Iraq, the government signed an action plan to end and prevent the recruitment and use of children by the Popular Mobilization Forces. Additionally, 1,448 Iraqi children were repatriated from northeast Syria. The United Nations is engaging actively in other situations and with parties to these situations, such as in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Ukraine, and the Russian Federation, all of which I have recently visited, to secure concrete and practical commitments to protect children and put in place prevention plans and/or protection plans. In other situations, progress was achieved through the adoption of handover protocols, the development of child protection policies, the strengthening of legislation, and the integration of child protection in peace processes and national dialogues. United Nations engagement also focused on training and awareness raising, reaching thousands of stakeholders. Notably, 12,460 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups were released and were provided with protection or reintegration support. These achievements are important and meaningful, and I commend every single person who was involved in attaining them. Going forward, however, much bigger strides are required. We urgently need bold and resolute action. We must build on the international consensus on child protection and rally behind the instruments that have already been agreed upon widely. This includes the definition of a child as everyone under the age of 18, as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, must be protected. I urge all of you to embrace peace and peaceful resolution of conflicts, which remains the only sustainable way to reduce and prevent violations against children. I call on you to boost financing for child protection programs, including meeting the enormous needs for reintegration programs, which far outpace the resources currently available. It is heartbreaking when children that have been released from recruitment and use or encountered after and during other violations find that there is, in fact, no safe place for them to go and no support available. The financing of demining action programs and mine education should also be a priority, given the devastating impact of explosive remnants of war on children globally. I would also like to underline that the monitoring and reporting mechanism is only as strong as the resources and capacities given for its operations, including budgetary resources and staff positions and capacity building. This is particularly salient as between 2022 and 2023, 5 new situations have been added to the agenda of children and armed conflict, including Niger and Haiti this year. It is important for Friends of the Mandate to support the MRM in budgetary decisions, including in the 5th Committee and in United Nations budgets. Furthermore, the resources of UNICEF country offices specifically dedicated to the MRM monitoring and response and the reintegration of children also need to be preserved and sustained, while building similar child protection capacity and expertise in other UN entities as part of country task forces for monitoring and reporting on violations against children in armed conflict. Lastly, we need to put children at the center of our efforts and hear their voices. Therefore, I am committed to working on 4 major areas during 2023 and forward: advocating for peaceful resolution of conflict, improving the directives for monitors to best identify grave violations, increasing the resources available for child protection expertise on the ground, and the development of a new public awareness campaign that aims at putting the voices of children at the center of all our work. This campaign will be child-focused and will include their participation, their views, and their voices for us to better respond to their concerns. In this regard, I thank Violeta for being here today to share with all of us her recommendations on how to involve children in peace-building processes. I, for one, remain hopeful that our joint engagement, dedication, and action can lead to positive change for children trapped in war. I remain deeply committed to their protection. I invite you all to join me in this. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Gamba for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Omar Abdi.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished